Good morning. This hearing of the Senate Appropriations Committee will please come to order. We are here today to discuss the President's supplemental funding request for the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security with Secretary Becerra and Secretary Mayorkas. We heard last week about the interrelated challenges we are seeing across the globe, and Senator Collins and I are continuing our work on a bipartisan package to support Ukraine, Israel, and our partners in the Indo-Pacific and deliver absolutely vital humanitarian aid. And as we heard last week, it is vital we do these together in one package and not break them apart, such as an Israel-only bill like the one that the House passed last week. We face connected threats across many regions, and we can and should be addressing foes like Putin and supporting allies and populations facing war and famine all at the same time. But it's also important we treat the challenges we face here at home with the same urgency, which is why I'm pleased that President Biden has also requested supplemental funding to keep the child care sector afloat, to help communities recovering from disasters, to fight the fentanyl crisis, address the needs at our southern border, continue affordable broadband for families, prevent a pay cut for brave wildland firefighters, and more. And while today's hearing will focus on requests for HHS and DHS, I'm going to continue to work with my colleagues to meet all the key priorities that the President's outlined. But I want to be clear to Republicans who think there is a chance to jam a huge far-right wish list on immigration. The recent proposal that revived Trump's border wall, closed our doors on asylum seekers, and rewrote immigration laws is not going to go anywhere. We need to focus on the ideas that can actually get widespread bipartisan support that address the root causes of migration that's almost entirely absent from the proposal, and meeting the operational needs like those we're here today to talk about. We need to focus on serious proposals. Now, today we are here to address many of the challenges that are top of mind for families back in Washington State. I hear about the child care crisis everywhere I go, and I know my colleagues are hearing from parents and businesses with some of the same stories. Now, I've been talking about child care since I came here, and to this day, it's a top priority for me. Just last month, I actually visited a child care center in Shoreline Community College, which is where I used to teach, and I heard from families firsthand about how incredibly hard it is right now. I want us all to remember that you can't have an economy that works for working families without a strong child care system. And right now, our child care system is just plain broken. I fought hard to create the Child Care Stabilization Program that supported 220,000 child care providers and nearly 10 million kids and prevented thousands of programs from closing their doors. This funding did exactly what it was supposed to do. It stabilized the child care market. It allowed child care providers who operate on razor-thin margins to retain the staff they needed and avoid major price hikes for our families, and kept serving kids. But that funding has now expired, and our child care system is once again hanging on by a thread. If we do not act soon, the child care crisis is going to keep getting worse, and it will hurt our economy in the process. Child care providers are facing impossible choices today: reducing their pay, laying off staff, raising prices, serving fewer families, and shutting their doors because the math just doesn't work. This, of course, means parents are getting squeezed even worse as child care gets harder and harder to find and even harder to afford. In Washington State, parents in the Tri-Cities area spend a fifth of their income on child care. Right now, tens of thousands of Americans are being forced to miss work because they can't get child care. Make no mistake, that hurts businesses, and it hurts our entire economy. And since the stabilization funds have run dry, this problem will only continue getting worse unless we take action. We're talking about even greater damage to our economy, billions in lost wages, revenue, and growth, and we can't let that happen. We have made important bipartisan progress in strengthening annual child care funding, including in our Senate labor HHS bill this summer, but we've got to do more to meet this crisis and act on the President's request. So to my Republican colleagues, let's work together to address this growing economic problem in all of our states. And of course, there are the other issues that Congress needs to act on as well. The President has requested additional funding to address the fentanyl crisis head-on, to meet operational requirements and needs at our southern border, and improve the USCIS processing capacity. It's important that we work together in a serious, bipartisan fashion to address those challenges. We are facing significant numbers of encounters at the border each day and seizing record amounts of fentanyl. Just as we did with the fiscal year 2024 Homeland Security Bill, this committee needs to work in a bipartisan way to address the reality that our federal agencies are dealing with on the ground. When it comes to the opioid crisis, I've sat down with so many people on the front lines all across my state, first responders, healthcare workers, patients who are in recovery, parents who do not know what to do when their child is suffering from an addiction. I have heard so many heavy stories that I bring with me to work every day, stories that demand action from this Congress. And I know every member on this dais has heard similar heartbreaking stories about the devastation of the opioid crisis. None of the people we represent who are on the front lines of this crisis want us to play politics with their lives. So I hope we are all able to have a very serious, respectful conversation about real solutions to this crisis. Let's talk about funding for mental health and substance use disorder treatments, and let's talk about health and public safety. And let's absolutely talk about stopping fentanyl from entering our country and our communities and disrupting and dismantling the transnational criminal organizations that are producing and trafficking it. But we cannot grandstand for political points. The President has requested critical funding to modernize our illicit drug detection systems and technology, to stop fentanyl from coming into our country, to break up the supply chains that are used to produce it in the first place, and support those fighting the opioid crisis in their communities. We've got to act on those requests, as well as the President's funding request to meet operational requirements and needs at the southern border. And I hope that instead of wasting time on partisan non-starters, we actually can work together, all of us, on common sense bipartisan solutions to help us humanely manage encounters at the border, process claims of non-citizens seeking protection under our nation's asylum laws, while continuing our country's long tradition of welcoming people who flee violence and persecution. We need to fund basic DHS needs like short-term facilities, transportation, medical care, and other related activities that provide a humane environment for asylum seekers while in DHS custody, and support the critical work of border communities, NGOs, and our frontline staff. We should all be able to agree that we need to make sure that the folks who safeguard our borders have the resources they need to do their jobs safely, humanely, and effectively, and that reducing the USCIS backlog is a good thing as is in continuing our work to welcome refugees from across the world at a time when so many people are suffering, which is why we also need to fund HHS programs to prevent drastic cuts for states and organizations around the country who are helping refugees settle. To be clear, these are refugees who are fleeing persecution around the world, including Rohingya and Uyghur refugees admitted through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, Cubans who are fleeing the oppressive regime there, and Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. Making sure we can adequately support the resettlement of these refugee populations isn't just the right thing to do, it also supports important national security and strategic interests. So let's talk about serious bipartisan ideas to address these challenges, and let's be clear, tackling everything from the child care crisis to the opioid crisis and beyond requires more than supplemental funding. It requires us to pass our strong, full-year appropriations bills like this committee has put forward. When we operate on one CR after another, our agencies are stuck in neutral. They cannot plan for the future. They have to delay initiatives and investments, and they are far less equipped to meet the pressing challenges we face. Just about every national security official has told us it hamstrings their work to keep America safe. So I hope we can continue to make bipartisan progress on supplemental funding to respond to the urgent needs at home and abroad, and our annual appropriations bills to set up our nation for success in the year ahead. As we talked about last week, there are some pressing needs across the world right now, but there's no reason for that to stop us from responding to needs right here at home, too. At such a crucial moment, we cannot afford to treat this as a zero-sum game. We are the United States of America. We can, we should, and we must stand with our allies around the world and tackle the challenges our families face here at home. I strongly believe that, and I'm going to continue doing everything I can to make sure we rise to the occasion and provide all the resources necessary to meet this moment. I will turn it over to Vice Chair Collins.
Thank you very much, Chair Murray, for holding this second hearing on the administration's supplemental budget requests. I look forward to hearing the testimony of both Secretary Mayorkas and Secretary Becerra on the President's emergency supplemental requests for their departments, just as last week we heard from the Department of Defense and the Department of State. Before I address the focus of this hearing, let me personally thank both secretaries for their responses to the horrific shootings that occurred in my state in Lewiston. Secretary Mayorkas deployed nearly 100 personnel from various DHS components to assist state and local officials and the affected families. Thank you for that. The Department of Health and Human Services personnel offered critical behavioral and mental health services in the wake of this tragedy. I'm grateful for these efforts. Turning to the President's supplemental appropriations request, I look forward to discussing with both secretaries what is required to provide effective border security to stem the flood of illegal migrants and fentanyl into the United States. For fiscal year 2023, the U.S. Border Patrol reported a record 2.5 million encounters with foreign nationals entering the United States along the southwest border without authorization. Think about that number. That means that there were nearly twice as many encounters at the southwest border as there are people in the entire state of Maine. And that enormous number does not include what Border Patrol agents describe as the gotaways, those who did not turn themselves in and eluded capture. Communities throughout our country are struggling to absorb the influx of migrants as they are released pending an adjudication of their claims, a process that can take years. In Portland, Maine, a city of 68,000 residents, more than 1,600 asylum seekers have arrived since January. Sanford, Maine, which has a population of 22,000, has had nearly 400 migrants arrive since the month of May. The cost for Sanford, a much smaller city, to provide food and housing assistance to recently arrived asylum seekers is more than 3 times as much as the city spends for residents needing assistance. Not only has the failure to control the border led to unchecked migration, but also it has contributed to the illegal drug crisis. Mexican drug cartels are using the chaos at the southern border to facilitate their trafficking operations. Using cars, trucks, and other modes of distribution, they are sending record amounts of fentanyl into our country, enough to kill every American many times over. Maine, like so many other states, has seen record increases in recent years in the number of overdose deaths, nearly 80% of which are fentanyl related. We lost 462 Mainers in the first 9 months of 2023 to fatal overdoses. 341 of these deaths are fentanyl related. An out-of-control border poses a real threat to our homeland and our people. Since fiscal year 2021, 282 individuals apprehended by Border Patrol at the southwestern border were on the terrorist watch list, compared to only 11 such individuals in the previous 4 years. Additional resources are necessary, but they're only part of the answer to these national security and public health crises. Targeted funding must be accompanied by policy changes that ensure that our borders are secure, that our immigration system is not exploited, and that is fair to those who legally immigrate. And let me be clear, immigrants who have come to our country legally have contributed greatly to the fabric of our economy and our communities. I very much look forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Mayorkas.
Thank you, Chair Murray, Vice Chair Collins, distinguished members of this committee. Every day, the 260,000 men and women of the Department of Homeland Security enforce our laws, secure our border, and safeguard our communities. They have seized more fentanyl in the last 2 years than in the previous 5 years combined. They have removed or returned from the United States more than 350,000 non-citizens since the ending of pandemic-era rules under Title 42. They have arrested the leaders of transnational criminal organizations and are disrupting and dismantling the smuggling organizations that exploit the vulnerable. They help families everywhere, from Hawaii and Mississippi to Florida and Vermont, rebuild after the devastation of a natural disaster. They support communities during tragedies, like the one that struck Lewiston 2 weeks ago, and get local stakeholders across the country the resources they need to help prevent another such attack. They do all of this and much more, despite being perennially underfunded and inadequately resourced. That is why our administration has submitted the critical supplemental border and homeland security funding requests we are here to discuss today. It would be a disservice to the American people and to the men and women who safeguard our homeland not to approve it. Consider fentanyl. Drug overdoses have been a leading cause of preventable American deaths every year for a decade, driven over the past 5+ years by this incredibly cheap, incredibly potent opioid smuggled into our country by cartels, primarily via cars and trucks driven by American citizens. Our administration has repeatedly asked Congress to help us modernize our ports of entry to ensure we can expedite lawful trade and travel and focus our efforts on bad actors. We continue to call on Congress to fully fund the personnel and resources needed to achieve this goal and to fully deploy new imaging technology to enhance our ability to inspect all vehicles and trucks that enter our country. Our national security supplemental funding request will help do so, sending 1,000 additional officers and investigators to ports of entry, deploying over 100 cutting-edge detection machines across hotspots, and funding additional international anti-trafficking operations. We are facing economic, political, and climate instability across the world, exacerbated in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, instability that is fueling the greatest level of global migration since World War II. This is also true in our hemisphere. Despite operating under the constraints of a broken immigration system that Congress has failed to update since 1996, our administration has pursued a comprehensive strategy to manage this unprecedented migration. Our strategy includes expanded lawful pathways for migration, strengthened consequences for unlawful entry at the border, removing a record number of individuals found to be ineligible for protection under the law, and increased partnership across the region to curb irregular migration. The same supplemental funding request will increase these efforts, enabling the hiring and deployment of 1,300 new Border Patrol agents, 1,400 attorneys and staff to support immigration cases, and 2,700 new asylum officers and staff. It will expand our capacity for safe and humane border enforcement. It will provide $1.4 billion to communities that need additional support and expedite the issuance of work authorization documents for eligible non-citizens. Within our homeland, extreme heat, wildfires, and devastating hurricanes are increasing in frequency and severity, and Congress's support of FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund has not kept pace. Our domestic supplemental funding request would allocate $9 billion to the Disaster Relief Fund, enabling us to deploy more first responders and better support recovery projects whenever and wherever disaster strikes. In the wake of the horrific Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel on October 7, we have seen an increase in threats against Jewish, Muslim, and Arab American communities and institutions across our country, adding to a pre-existing increase in the level of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world. Our department's nonprofit security grant program requires additional support to meet this new mandate. The domestic supplemental funding request would do so, providing the program an additional $200 million and allowing us to help mitigate violent extremist and terrorist attacks. Ensuring the safety and security of the American people must be more than just a talking point. We owe those who protect our country better. We owe them the funding, resources, and support needed to do their dangerous and difficult jobs. We owe them this supplemental funding package. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our administration's proposal with you today. I look forward to answering.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Collins. We will now very briefly introduce today's witnesses and move to their testimony. I'm very pleased today to welcome Secretary of Health and Human Services, Javier Becerra, and Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Thank you to each of you for coming today and taking your time to be with us and to answer our questions. And we will now begin with opening remarks. Secretary Becerra will begin with you.
Chair Murray, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the President's emergency supplemental funding request for the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm pleased to be here with Secretary Mayorkas to answer your questions. We work closely and depend on each other regularly to address critical domestic priorities and national security interests. At HHS, we're working to lower healthcare costs with better care for more Americans. Among our top priorities are strengthening behavioral health and addressing the overdose epidemic. We're making meaningful progress on these issues, thanks in large part to the past support from Congress. But to continue that forward movement will require ongoing attention and adequate funding. The President's emergency supplemental funding request proposes $22.2 billion for HHS. The largest and most urgent request, $16 billion, will ensure millions of American families do not lose access to affordable child care. Emergency funding will also be deployed to help local communities battle the scourge of opioids, including illicitly manufactured fentanyl. The President's request will fund critical heating and energy assistance to households as we quickly approach the cold of winter. And these funds would make sure our system supporting refugees, including our Afghan and Ukrainian brothers and sisters, continue to support our state and local partners. Finally, and of course, our request ensures that communities, first responders, and survivors of tragedy will continue to receive customary disaster recovery and response services through HHS. Whether it was the residents of Maui devastated by the wildfires, the people in Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, and South Carolina whose homes and livelihoods were ripped apart by dangerous storms, or the families of Allen, Texas, Monterey, California, and most recently, Lewiston, Maine, shattered by mass shootings, our recovery and response teams were there for them. If there is one thing that is sadly predictable, it's that there will be more disasters in the future. With your support, HHS will be ready. Childcare. Madam Chair, you said it. Childcare in this country is either unaffordable or unavailable for millions of Americans. The average cost of childcare ranges from $5,000 to over $17,000 a year, depending on where you are in the country. That's like college tuition for most families, but for kids who haven't even started kindergarten. Prices are untenable for families, even in the lowest priced areas. Providers, meanwhile, operate on thin margins, and childcare workers receive disgracefully low wages, lower than almost any other occupation. Child care stabilization funds helped raise wages for workers. Parents need affordable, high-quality childcare options so they can work or go to school or participate in training programs or simply support their families. It is vital to the success of our communities. It is vital to our economy. To many families who are forced to choose between keeping their paycheck or caring for the child, can you imagine trying to sleep at night? The President's American Rescue Plan in 2021 made it possible for child care programs to stay open during the worst of the pandemic. And here I have to thank so many of you who worked so hard to get those child care funds. Hundreds of thousands of child care providers and millions of children benefited from the ARP's child care stabilization grants. Left unaddressed, the crisis in our child care system threatens to undermine our progress as a nation. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of kids and parents in each of your states could lose out on coverage unless Congress commits to additional funds. The emergency funding request would shore up the child care sector and mitigate the likelihood that providers will close their doors or raise child care fees for families in the face of a child care workforce shortage. As with child care, the urgent and emergent challenges we must address on opioids and fentanyl and in meeting our legal obligations to our newest Americans require all of government approaches. For that reason, we come before you with the President's emergency supplemental request. I'm grateful for Congress recognizing the importance of these issues, and I look forward to discussing our emergency funding request with you. I yield.